So this is your brake pad here. Now this customer came in to get their brakes replaced. They were complaining about the brakes being a little noisy. And if you can see here, there's a little bit of irregular wear here. That little bit of irregularity is all that you really need to start getting symptoms like brake noise, brake pulsation, which is the pedal vibrating underneath your foot as you apply the brake. Those things are kind of indicators that the brake system isn't working as well as it could. And right there is a little bit of evidence right there. So what we're going to do is replace the pads and rotors, and that's going to make sure that everything's working the way it should be. So the thickness of this brake is actually really good. It's just that little bit of irregular wear that's causing those issues. We actually have a thickness gauge right here, and you can see here that on this thickness gauge it's green. You know, that brake pad is good. It's at about 8 millimeters. No concerns with the longevity of this brake pad here. As the brake pad starts to wear, it's going to wear down to this point here where this groove actually kind of wears off. And at that point you want to think about replacing it. Even though the thickness is okay, that brake dust actually uses that groove to migrate out of the braking system. That's going to help, one, keep the braking system clean. Two, it's going to help keep heat from building up in this brake pad here, which is going to reduce the effectiveness of the brake pad. And if that heat builds up excessively, it's going to reduce the lifetime and performance of the brake rotor. It's also going to start impacting the brake caliper. You don't want to wear out or stress out the calipers at all. You really want the brake pads and the brake rotors to bear the brunt of the braking force. The calipers are pretty expensive to repair and replace. The brake pads and rotors are not. So you want these to be the items that are wearing out. So this is a brake pad that's worn out completely. You can see there in the thickness gauge that there's pretty much nothing left. You want to replace them before they get to that point. You want to replace them at about this point here, because at this point, not only is the brake pad completely gone and you're going to have issues bringing the vehicle to a stop, you're going to damage the brake rotor, you're going to cause permanent damage to that brake rotor. There's no chance of using it again. And there's the risk of damaging the brake caliper as well. Again, you don't want to damage the brake caliper. They're pretty expensive to replace. You really want to be replacing the pads and the rotors. That's about it. Here's one more example of a thickness gauge, and you can see here compared to a good thickness brake pad, pretty obvious what makes this a good brake pad. And then when you start looking at a completely worn out pad, again at this point the brake, it's no good. You want to get that replaced right away. So ordinarily, these brake pads would sit inside of this brake caliper bracket. Now, when you're replacing brake pads and rotors, the bracket also deserves attention. This shim right here helps keep the brake pad in the bracket. You can see here, if the shim isn't sized correctly or if it's missing, it's going to kind of wiggle back and forth. That's going to cause noise. It's going to cause the brake pad to wear out prematurely. It could actually cause damage to the bracket, the rotor, or the caliper. So you want to make sure that these are properly fitted, nice and clean when they're installed, because you can see they accumulate dust as the brake pad wears, and you want to make sure that they're there in the first place. So when you're replacing them, not only do you want to make sure that the new shims are good and clean, you want to make sure they fit well, and you want to make sure that underneath them, all this area is getting cleaned out of brake dust as well, because any brake dust deposits in here will prevent this from sitting properly, and you're going to have issues as if this were wrong in the first place. The other thing that deserves attention on these is the slide pins. These interact with the other side of the caliper to help keep the brake pads against the rotor, as well as applying the braking force. Now, these slide pins here do have to be cleaned up and greased when brake pads are installed. If they're not, they start getting rusty. If they start getting rusty, they could possibly seize. That's going to basically cause the brake caliper to freeze. It's either going to freeze and drag or seize the brake caliper, and then the brake rotor is not going to move freely, the wheel's not going to move freely, or it's going to seize open, and no matter how hard you push on the brake pedal, it's never going to compress the brakes. So one thing to make sure you do is use a high quality grease when you're greasing up these slide pins. A low quality grease or no grease at all, or the improper kind of grease, is going to wear out prematurely. A good synthetic brake grease is going to last the lifetime of the brake pads. So you'll only have to worry about greasing these up the next time you replace your brakes. So in this case here, you can see a bit of rust building up on the outside of the slide pin here. If a better grease was used, that probably would not have occurred. This could impact the effectiveness and the lifetime of this brake caliper. So you want to use a good grease when you replace them. So this is the brake rotor. Ordinarily the brake pad sits right on top of here. You can see that's why it's worn around this edge here. That's the surface that the brake pad actually pushes against to bring the vehicle to a stop. Now this is a disc brake system. Not everyone has a disc brake system in the rear. Some people have a drum brake system. However, even if you have a disc brake system, you may still have a drum brake system inside of it. This vehicle is equipped with a drum parking brake. And a drum brake system is going to operate pretty similarly. The main difference is that a drum parking brake is not designed to be used to stop the vehicle. A true drum brake is going to be a little more robust. It's going to be able to handle the stress and bring the vehicle to a stop. This parking brake is not equipped for that. If you try to use this to stop the vehicle, you're going to damage it. So one important thing to make sure when working with drum brake systems is to make sure that everything is lubricated, moving freely. If your springs here are rusty or broken, that could cause issues with the braking system. Same thing with the retainers here. You can see this one is pretty rusty. Another thing to make sure that gets done is when you're maintaining or replacing a drum brake system, back here behind the brake shoe, there are contact points against the backing plate. So you want to make sure that these get greased up. That's going to help keep rust from building up. It's going to make sure that brake dust doesn't get between the two surfaces. That's going to help make sure that the shoe travels freely and can push against that brake drum and bring the vehicle to a stop. Or in this case, with a parking brake, hold the vehicle in place. You also want to make sure that these get adjusted regularly, because as the brake drum wears out, it actually changes in size and the distance that it has to travel increases. So without adjusting that, you're going to lose brake effectiveness over time. So it's important when you get your vehicle brought in for safety inspection that if you have a drum brake system, or if you have a parking brake system that isn't working as well as it used to, that you ask us to inspect it. We can do a service called a clean and adjust. We'll basically clean up the rust as best as we can, clean all the old brake dust out, and lubricate the brake shoes against the backing plate so that they can travel freely. What we'll also do at that time is adjust these so that these are sitting properly, and basically as soon as you operate the braking system, either the parking brake or the brake pedal in the case of a true drum brake system, that they're going to come into contact with that brake drum right away and give you the stopping force that the system really needs. So this customer came in for a brake inspection. One thing that we're going to do, we're not just going to look at the brake rotor, we're not just going to look at the brake pads, we want to look at the system as a whole. That's going to include the brake lines as they come back to the brake hose, and then the brake hose as it comes to the brake caliper. We're going to inspect these lines, make sure they're not broken, make sure they're not too rusty. If these rust up to a certain point, they're actually going to start to seep, or they could rupture. That's going to give you a leak in the brake system, and that's going to affect the brake system as a whole, even if it's just leaking in the back here. Not something you want to have happen. One reason why we make sure to inspect the brake lines when we're doing a brake inspection. Same thing with the hoses. As the hoses get on in age, they start to develop cracks right here. They start to crack along the length of the hose. You may actually notice bubbles or frays. If they're improperly installed, they may rub against something and cause a weak point. So you want to make sure that these are kind of uniform all the way around, that there's no weak point here, because any weak point could cause a rupture. So the reason why it's so important to make sure that everything going to the caliper is good is because you're relying on that brake fluid to push this piston out. If there's any compromise up here, this piston's not going to come out, the brake's not going to work. This is the part that actually moves and applies the pressure to the braking system. Now, if you get a lot of corrosion or brake dust in here, or if your brake fluid has a lot of moisture in it, this could start to corrode inside the caliper. And if this piston seizes, your brake system is useless. If it seizes with the brakes against the rotor, then your brakes are going to lock up and they're never going to come free. If this seizes with the piston inside, then no matter how hard you push on the pedal, you're never going to apply braking pressure to this rotor. It's not going to help you bring the vehicle to a stop. So another reason why brake fluid maintenance is so important is because if this doesn't work, nothing else here is going to work. So at this point, we've inspected the brake system. We've determined that the brake rotors and the brake pads need to be replaced. We'll do that for this customer. They'll be good to go from here. Okay, so in this case, we are going to clean up the parking brake here. So what he's doing is spraying it down. That's going to help any brake dust to loosen up, kind of drip out of there on its own. Now he's going to blow the rest out. So now he's going to grease up all the contact points between the brake shoes and the backing plate. That's going to help keep everything moving freely. and keep corrosion from building up back there. So one thing you want to make sure you do with new parts is they're going to come with a light coating of oil on them just to keep them from building up rust as they sit in storage. So you do want to spray that off before you install them. If you leave that on there, not only is that going to prevent the brakes from working right away, if there's a lot of oil on there, it could actually degrade the brakes themselves, and then your new parts are essentially ruined. It's important that you clean the caliper bracket before you install anything on there. And you want to make sure that you use a high quality grease when you're greasing up the slide pins. In this case, we are using brake caliper grease. A high quality brake grease here is going to make sure that the slide pins function as long as the brake pads last. It is critical to make sure that the new shims that are installed fit properly. You don't want them to touch the rotor at all, and you want the brake pads to fit in there snugly. A little bit of brake grease in there is also going to help keep the pads traveling freely, which is going to prevent noise or chatter as the brake pads wear. Again, this customer came in because they were experiencing noise with the brakes. Clearly they had the brakes done recently because these brake pads, as far as lifetime, are still quite good. They're only slightly worn. But again, they had a bit of irregular wear because the rotors were not making good contact with the brake pad. Compared to the new brake pad, you can see how much of a difference that makes. So what he's doing here is adjusting the parking brake. Basically, when you're adjusting any drum brake, you either want the shoes to be just inside of the brake drum, or even slightly touching them is okay. You don't want them to be far away from the brake drum. That's going to increase the travel distance and decrease the braking effort that they can exert on the drum. You don't want them too far into the drum either, because basically they're going to be permanently engaged until they wear out to the point that they're not, or permanently engaged until they break. So that's all that's involved with changing out the brakes. This was a pretty simple job. Brake pads and brake rotors. The parking brake has been cleaned and adjusted. Everything back here is going to work great for the customer. They're going to be really happy with the results.